Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming over to ISTC today to attend the seminar. And for those listening online, we're happy that you were available for the presentation today. So my name is Nancy Holm. I'm Assistant Director here at ISTC, and I'm the seminar organizer along with Beth Mashesky. This spring, as many of you know, we've been focusing on water conservation, water quality, and general sustainability topics. We have a schedule and flyers about the other seminars outside on the table here by the conference room. Then also they're on our website under events. In case you cannot attend in person ever, all the seminars are shown live via GoToWebinar, and we send out that link, or it's on our website, and then we archive them on the website. So with that, I'd like to ask everyone in attendance here to silence your cell phones if you haven't already. And then we're going to hold the questions to the end, and I'll come around with the microphone so we can record your questions as well as the answers from our speaker. For those listening online, we'll also have you, you can type in your questions at any time, and then we'll take those at the end. We're pleased today to have as our speaker Dr. Mark Davis, who's he's an associate survey scientist at the Illinois Natural History Survey, which is part of the Prairie Research Institute here on campus. He is the coordinator of their ecological genetics laboratory, and in addition, he serves as the science advisor for the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and he is also interim Illinois State White Nose Syndrome coordinator for studies on the syndrome which is affecting bats in Illinois and in other states. Mark received his bachelor's degree in English and zoology from North Dakota State University, a master's degree in zoology also from North Dakota State. He completed a second master's degree, this time in ecology from Colorado State University, and he was in environmental sciences from the University of Illinois. So today he'll be talking to us about conservation by design, promoting resilient, sustainable lands and waters in the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes. Please join me in welcoming Mark today.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. I'm going to apologize up front. I am battling both an NSF proposal and a head cold, so my voice is a little rough and my brain is a little fuzzy, so I hope you'll bear with me throughout my talk. I think we all realize that the Anthropocene is forcing unprecedented challenges on ecosystems throughout the world. These are big challenges that often transcend geopolitical boundaries, traditional ecosystems, and other factors. So these are really big waves that are crashing on the shores that many of us have to deal with. And so what this requires are innovative, creative solutions, a partnership-driven framework, and a new way of thinking about how we approach these challenges. And it's something that I've been trying to wrap my head around for the last few years, and it's something I'd like to talk to you about today. And really, I think the take-home point for my talk is going to be that these challenges we face exceed the responsibility of any individual agency or program and require a new paradigm for how we approach them. So creative, innovative solutions for these major problems. We start thinking about what these problems are. We think about hypoxic zones, which are popping up throughout the world. We think of harmful algal blooms, which are impacting a number of areas, both quality of life and the ecosystem. We think of climate change impacting throughout the world. We think about the unprecedented losses of biodiversity. And these are really big challenges. And the traditional way of approaching them, this sort of single focus, perhaps a species or a component of the ecosystem, has a real hard time moving the needle on these major issues. And so I propose a foundation for a 21st century conservation paradigm that's really a three-pronged approach. The first in the upper left is this notion of collective impact, the idea that we can do more collectively than any one individual organization or person can do. So coalescing around these big, multinational, interjurisdictional challenges in a collective fashion to leverage resources collectively to impact these issues. There's a few key components: a common agenda, common progress measures, mutually reinforcing activities, communications, and a backbone organization. I'll point to some of these throughout the talks for examples as we move forward. You can certainly visit that reference if you're more interested in collective impact. So the second prong to this 21st century approach is the idea of adaptive resource management, this cyclic approach to how we think about these problems, which begins with assessment, but then moves into design. So a data-driven design on the landscape, which we'll talk about in the future. Then implementation, so getting that collective group to work together in a strategic manner to drive changes on the landscape or on the waterscape. Then monitoring. We need to be able to assess how we're doing at moving the needle on conservation. It's not just enough to do these as a one-off, but then following up over the long term to see if we're achieving the goals we set out to achieve. Evaluation, then again answering that question, did we do the job we set out to do? And then adjusting, again, as new technologies emerge, as new methodologies emerge, as new techniques come out, how can we adjust to improve upon what we've been doing in the past in a collective approach to do a better job, to again get those net gains on the ground in conservation? And finally, it's increasingly important that we take this multidisciplinary approach, and I think that most, if not all of us, are aware and work in this multidisciplinary framework. We're using landscape ecology, IT, social science increasingly important, atmospheric science, biology. Any sort of paradigm that fits in with the problems that we're facing can fit in under this framework. And so it's really coalescing these disparate groups under a holistic, strategic approach to conservation of landscapes and waterscapes. And landscape conservation design has really emerged as sort of the preeminent model of this approach. It's an iterative, collaborative, holistic approach that provides information, analytical tools, spatially explicit data, and BNPs to develop shared conservation strategies and to achieve jointly held conservation partners. And I think the bottom line here is that we get down to this collective implementation. And we're moving away from the sort of conservation by accident approach of yesteryear, right? So we have an opportunity, a parcel of land comes available, we purchase it, we do some restoration activities, but it's not strategic. We don't necessarily know if this is the best investment, that we're going to get the highest ROI. So this landscape conservation design approach provides not only a process to achieve that more strategic landscape vision, but a number of products to go along with it, which I'll touch on later. And again, this shifts that paradigm from these opportunistic, random acts of conservation to this strategic approach that emphasizes leveraging partner capacities and resources. Again, just as one individual institution cannot tackle some of these big, large-scale challenges, collectively we can have a greater footprint by pooling capacities and resources to yield those net gains on the ground. In a very simple sense, this is the process, and I'll step through this very briefly, but we'll see as I move through my talk today some examples of how this actually looks. So the first step, again, is convening that collaborative conservation community and setting targets and goals. Then moving into the data gathering phase, so finding spatial layers to address those targets and goals, analyzing them in robust modeling frameworks, then driving those into maps and subsequent analyses to inform perhaps decision support tools, prioritization algorithms, and other implements that can be used to get those net gains on the ground. Finally, a key part is implementation. It's not enough to simply develop plans. I'm sure we're all part of plans that seem to just be planning for planning's sake. It doesn't get the job done. We need to implement. We need to get this on the ground. We need to get buy-in from not only partners, but the constituencies that live in these communities. I'll address on how we might get at that in a few slides. Traditionally, landscape conservation design has very much been a species-centric approach. In its initial incarnations, it was as simple as stacking up species occurrence data layers in a GIS mapping framework. And wherever you have the deepest stack of species occurring, that would be a priority conservation area. But I think we all recognize with these large-scale system problems, that's just not sufficient. While many of these species may be proxies for ecosystem processes, those functions that are essential to a healthy environment, there's a lot more to these systems that we need to account for. And perhaps more importantly is moving beyond the ecosystem approach to the realm of human well-being. Thinking about how these conservation actions can promote swimmable, fishable, drinkable waters into the future. And I think, interestingly enough, this has really been codified in the last few months. The White House put out a memorandum in October of 2015 mandating that federal agencies consider these ecosystem services in their programs as they move forward. It's simply not enough to focus alone on the functions of ecosystems. We need to consider those attendant values therein. And so it's received a great deal of emphasis in recent months. So to get those, we can yield a number of products from this landscape conservation design approach. You can see them enumerated here. They include story maps, prioritization tools. You'll see an example of a wetland prioritization tool in a few slides. Spatial data layers that can be mobilized to partners to utilize. Priority conservation management areas, conservation human well-being targets and goals. So looking at those metrics on how we evaluate the efficacy of the work that we're doing to promote conservation on the ground. Strategic targeting of conservation dollars. Again, this extends beyond simply developing a plan. It's taking that plan, strategically leveraging implementation funding, getting it into the hands of the partners who are doing that good work and who have been doing that good work on the ground for a number of years to create those solutions to these substantive issues. And finally, delivering it to those managers, collaboratively applying, leveraging implementation funding. Take-home point of this slide is really we're trying to produce products that address needs of our partners and then work with those partners to utilize them to make net gains on the ground by leveraging conservation dollars, which is increasingly challenging in many economic areas. I want to step through a few examples of how this has been deployed, some of the work that I've been doing. The first relates to the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes Landscape Conservation Cooperative. Nancy mentioned this organization. I serve as a science advisor, and we've been developing a coastal wetlands landscape conservation design over the past couple of years. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the landscape conservation cooperatives, about 5 or 6 years ago, the Department of the Interior set up this network of landscape conservation cooperatives. If we think back to one of my previous slides, the reason for this was underscored there. A lot of these challenges that we face, Gulf hypoxia, harmful algal blooms in western Lake Erie, habitat loss on a broad scale, transcend jurisdictional boundaries. And so having a collaborative group together, sitting at the same table, talking about these challenges over ecologically meaningful boundaries, not geopolitical boundaries, can provide a framework for that collective action that we can use to address these major issues that we face. So there's a large network, as you can see. The geography that I'll be focusing on for the next little bit is right here, the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes region, where the LCC is working on a number of fronts, including coastal wetlands, aquatic habitat connectivity, and northern forests. As I mentioned, this is very much a collaborative process. These are the groups that are currently involved, but that number is growing by the day. Last week, we held our first coastal wetlands workshops in Saginaw Bay and Lake St. Clair, Michigan. And so even this is outdated now, we added a number of additional partners. And so really what the LCC is not an initiative of the Department of the Interior. It's the people from these organizations that are sitting around a table thinking about how we tackle these large-scale problems. And one of these problems that was identified was the issue with coastal wetlands in the Great Lakes geography. High-quality coastal wetlands do remain throughout the Great Lakes, but traditional functions and values that we associate with those coastal wetlands in many contexts are being lost, degraded, or diminished in their capacity to provide ecosystem services, which includes the mitigation of negative environmental influences. Their ability to impact water quality is being degraded for a number of reasons. Their ability to promote habitat for wildlife are being degraded. And so the loss of coastal wetlands has been a major concern, so much so that the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative has mandated that 60,000 acres of wetland be restored, enhanced, or protected by 2020 in the Great Lakes geography. And so there's been a concerted effort to promote and improve wetlands in the Great Lakes for a number of reasons. And so we've been using this landscape conservation design framework to address this challenge. Don't want to bog you down with a lot of language here, but this is really the nut. We're looking at conservation targets and human well-being targets to meet multiple goals. So again, thinking about fish, wildlife, water quality, flood mitigation, and other factors, in addition to human health and well-being. Engaging new partners to find where our alignments in terms of our goals lie, and then emphasizing those. mapping where to work to benefit these things and ultimately yield an optimization so that people investing in conservation on the ground can be a lot more strategic than we have been in the past. We're looking at Saginaw Bay down to Old Woman Creek, so think about western Lake Huron all the way down to western Lake Erie. We're holding stakeholder meetings, building data sets, formatting them for analyses, then moving into developing websites, fact sheets, workshops, looking at the conservation targets that we've identified, how they relate spatially within our target geography, and then can scale up throughout the basin. And then really develop this prioritization algorithm and decision support tool. And the final phase is, again, implementation before we move into monitoring and adaptation. So it's the general framework. I won't revisit the slide, but it's going to be the same for the other two examples that I present as we move forward. So where are we? Again, this is the geography we're thinking about. We're in Saginaw Bay to the north all the way down to western Lake Erie. And so it's a pretty broad area. The total study area is the same area as the state of Maryland. So it's a pretty large footprint. Over 800,000 acres of coastal wetlands can be found in this area. So a total area slightly larger than Rhode Island. So we're talking a big scale with a high diversity of wetlands. And we can see that on the next slide. We've got some large complexes up to the north. I just came back last week from Saginaw, and it's beautiful up there. There are a lot of really nice wetlands in that area. High density, large protected wetlands. But as we think about that gradient as we move to the south, we see it transition to more sporadic distribution. If you're familiar with this geography, you also recognize that we're moving into some urban areas as we move farther south. So approximately 13% of our focal area that we know of is wetlands at this point. So we're looking at this as a great opportunity for protection, enhancement, and restoration. Other reason why we're here, thinking about the sort of 21st century approach to landscape conservation, is that we do cover 2 states, 30 counties, 2 large urban centers. And as we ramp this out, we're planning to scale this up throughout the basin. We're going to be talking about a binational area. We'll be working with Canada to do this there as well. And so we have many organizations actively working in these coastal wetlands. And I think that's one of the salient points that I want to drive home, is that one of the benefits of working in the upper Midwest and Great Lakes region is that there is an impressive history of collaborative conservation from which to build on. For any of you that have worked out in the western states, you know that can be a whole different ballgame with water law issues, land usage issues. And so this sort of institutionalized nature of collaboration is not as strong in certain contexts as it is in the Great Lakes. And so it really gives us good footing to build upon. And ultimately providing that amazing capacity to collectively attain those shared goals and objectives as they relate to coastal wetlands. So while there are opportunities, there are also challenges. We see a lot of urbanization in this area, both in Toledo and Detroit. You can see those yellow areas are just the expansion since 1985. It's the same story down in Toledo. What's not depicted on this map, and what I won't depict for brevity's sake, is that as you move away from the metropolitan areas in southern Michigan and western Ohio, we also see a great deal of conversion of the landscape to agricultural practices as well. And so we have those impacts that are driving that we're seeing in Lake Erie, which wetlands can have an impact on by serving as the kidneys for the Great Lakes. And so this transitioning of the landscape from what we see up in Saginaw Bay, where you have some more clean, pristine areas, towards the south, it's not the case. And with climate change, that's all moving north. And so we predict in the future that these same pressures are going to be at play throughout this geography that we're starting in. So why do we want to do this now? Again, as I mentioned before, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative has mandated 60,000 acres of wetlands restored, protected, or enhanced in the Great Lakes region by 2020. And so you see a lot of opportunities on restoration, protection, enhancement, and so we need to strategically leverage how we get there. And so there's a couple of outputs that have been developed through this Landscape Conservation Design Initiative that we're rolling out to get at that 60,000 acres. And the first that we're really excited about is some work that our partners at USGS have done, identifying potentially restorable wetlands. As we started thinking about this landscape conservation design, you realize that existing wetlands, there's only so much you can do, right? So those that are, say, that have Phragmites or other invasive species can be enhanced by addressing those issues. Those that are in relatively good shape but aren't in protected areas can be purchased and then converted to protected areas. So there's a limit to what you can do there. But we know that there's been a lot of conversion and that these converted areas can be identified as these potentially restorable wetlands. And so working with USGS, they've taken soil data and LIDAR to develop a model that they've looked at the landscape on a parcel-by-parcel basis to show, okay, well, we see this plot in the red areas, it's a heat map, indicates those places that are of high wetland. And so in the past, how we would do business is a parcel would come up for sale, and we think about, well, we want to restore wetlands, so let's just buy this land and turn it into a wetland. Well, the soils might not be right. The bathymetry in the adjacent lake might not be right. There are other factors that go into it. With this information, we can make strategic decisions on how we purchase those lands. This would be a great plot to restore as a wetland. The one, 2 parcels down might not be. We now have this information to bring to bear and to make much better strategic decisions. And so we're really excited about this tool that we're rolling out. We're also developing a prioritization tool. Again, thinking about those existing wetlands, how we prioritize where and how we invest our funds. And so I do want to point out this continuum here. The USGS work that I just highlighted, looking at this area of the continuum, we've kind of been ignoring the hard structures like parking lots. They may be a lost cause for conversion to wetlands, but as we moved into develop urban coastal ag fields or dike wetlands, we see their potential. We also want to think about those that are existing. Those wetlands, prioritize them based on a number of categories. The data that we're tending to use here are indices of biological integrity. So looking at the community composition within wetlands and comparing them to reference sites to get an idea of their sort of general health and well-being, if you will, to, again, drive those strategic investments and maximize our return on investment. If there's a wetland that's completely choked out by invasive species, it may not be the best bang for our buck, and so we need to think strategically there. And ultimately promote resilient ecosystems, so trying to get those 60,000 acres to be high-quality acres that will be resilient as the climate changes. We've identified a number of users, and we're excited. I think the rollout for both of these tools is going to be the end of the summer, and so August is when we're looking at having these available to our partners in the geography, that will then feed into our priority conservation portfolio. And so moving forward really quickly on this coast. Just about exactly a year ago, we were announced as one of the first of 4 of the White House's Resilient Lands and Waters initiatives. And so it was a good thing to hang our hat on that we got some recognition for it, but it also increased the scrutiny. We've been meeting almost every other month with the White House on the work that we're doing, producing information, maps, and keeping them updated on what we've been doing. And so because of the, I guess, emphasis that I haven't touched on here that we have in this work on human health and well-being in that geography, with the mandate that came out in October, it became pretty visible, and so it's been an exciting time. What's come along with it that we've been excited about for our partners is that the White House Council on Environmental Quality is now interested in helping our collaborative conservation community in this geography leverage implementation funding. And so that's always obviously the limiting factor for what you can do as a manager on the ground. Having a high-profile organization like the White House behind this work is really helping us get implementation funding to get at those 60,000 acres of coastal wetland restoration, enhancement, and protection. And finally, we're going to export this process to other geographies. I'll be talking about 2 of those as I move forward. But we really designed this approach, this landscape conservation design approach, not only for coastal wetlands, but in a more general sense, to be scalable throughout the Great Lakes. We don't just want this to be from Saginaw Bay down to western Lake Erie. We want to take this to other places, and that's going to be the long-term plan for this work. Shifting gears a little bit, because of the work that was done in the Saginaw Bay to Western Lake Erie geography, the Green Bay Conservation Partners approached the Prairie Research Institute and myself about developing a landscape conservation design for the Lower Fox River and Green Bay geography. Have a little bit different challenge and opportunities here. The Lower Fox River Green Bay ecosystem has a lot of problems that I think will resonate with us here in Illinois. Nutrient loading, habitat degradation, other stressors have impacted this area, both in the near term and the long term. But they do have this rich and deep tradition of collaboration and an outdoor heritage that I think uniquely positions them to really be a prime location for a landscape conservation design to ultimately improve that area for current and future generations. So here are the challenges that we're talking about. You know, I think a lot of these look right at home here in Illinois. Obviously, runoff from agricultural fields is a major issue. I think one of the main differences between that geography and here is that phosphorus is really the issue. The fall application of manure on agricultural fields has really increased sediment and phosphorus loading into that watershed. Invasive Phragmites has been a major problem, as it is throughout the Great Lakes Basin in the wetlands there, choking out wetlands and making it difficult for them to maintain their function and value. They obviously have industry associated with the watershed itself, so this is a working watershed that we have to be cognizant of. And finally, it's a developed area. Not only is it the home of the Packers, but it's a large urban center in Wisconsin. And so there's a lot of interests at play here. But again, I think it's important to emphasize that there is this deep and rich outdoor tradition, which I think has really been helpful in getting the constituency there on board for this work. And so here's the geography that we're looking at, and it's a lot different than we think about with coastal wetlands. And I'll point out that, yes, we are considering coastal wetlands in this landscape conservation design. You can see them in green on this corner of the map. We're also looking at Lower Green Bay and the Fox River itself, as well as its tributaries throughout this entire geography. In the light gray, we can see urban areas, both of green urban areas within this footprint, and then it's complete agricultural operations that include dairy farming, which is where all that phosphorus runoff comes from. And it's leading into the bay. And so in recent years, Green Bay has had a problem with hypoxic zone, and so fish die-offs and other issues, low biodiversity in the river itself for a number of reasons, both the current phosphorus loadings, but also the historic input of PCBs from the timber industry up the watershed. So a lot of challenges in this geography, but it really seems to be a good fit for a landscape conservation design that we started back in December of 2015. What I want to emphasize here, though, and I think that is interesting in the context of what's being done here at the ISTC, is that they're really kind of on the front edge of some of these innovative, creative solutions for dealing with these problems. And so in the Fox River area, the geography that I just showed you, they're setting up a phosphorus trading program to monetize phosphorus in that geography in the hopes of moving the needle to incentivize the reduction in the usage. And so that's just being set up and we're considering as a part of this landscape conservation design. In addition, there's already a network of demonstration farms that are deploying innovative management techniques, technologies, and other methodologies their impacts on the watershed. And I think that for some of you here at ISTC, there's some interesting synergies for potentially deploying some of the work that you're doing up in this geography. And finally, they've really leveraged a lot of strategic partnerships. I'll note here this is what's going to be the Cat Island chain. The Army Corps of Engineers has really wanted to dredge the river. Obviously, with high sediment loading, you get a lot of sedimentation. And so they need to dredge it out for the commerce, the barges moving up and down. Well, the Nature Conservancy and University of Wisconsin, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service all got together and thought about, well, what can we do with those dredgings? There used to be a chain of islands that were degraded, and so they're taking those dredgings and they're rebuilding this island and building partnerships with organizations that traditionally have had some challenges talking to one another. And it's been really successful. This is an older picture. If you look at the first three kind of fingers of the chain, they've restored the plant communities there, and they already are seeing changes in the area. So last spring they had their first breeding pair of the federally endangered piping plover show up, successfully breed, and so migratory bird communities are coming back, and it's an early success story. And by using a landscape conservation design framework, we're going to strategically approach how we do business going forward. And the final example I'll talk about a little bit, many of you have probably heard about, is the Resilient Watersheds initiative that the Prairie Research Institute kicked off back in October. We had our kickoff meeting, and I think it's very similar in a lot of respects to what's been occurring up in Green Bay. The watersheds in Illinois obviously have a number of challenges and opportunities. We see the same issues with sedimentation and runoff. Here, instead of phosphorus, it's nitrogen, right? So with all the corn production that's going on in this geography, a lot of nitrogen inputs. There's now been a mandate that by 2040, nitrogen loss from ag fields in Illinois has to be cut by 45%. That's a staggering number when you consider the amount that's on there and the potential human well-being impacts that could have. When you think about cutting nitrogen fertilizer by 45%, what's the impact on yield? Other challenges, again, thinking about economics, we have barge traffic, which is industry for Illinois, and so economic considerations here. We have invasive species that are increasingly prevalent in our watersheds in Illinois. And so there's myriad factors that we have to consider when we think about healthy, resilient watersheds in Illinois. And so we've done that as we were trying to roll out this resilient water, again, about those human health and well-being impacts. Obviously, we can't just eliminate ag production in Illinois. It's just not feasible. We have to find some win-wins there to balance productivity with reductions in nitrogen and improvements in our waterways. So how do we do that? How do we approach these human health and well-being considerations while trying to protect the economy and the agricultural community? The approach we're taking is sort of an adaptation of landscape conservation design that we're calling value-based landscape design. And so we're recognizing the functional aspects of the watershed to those human health being indicators. And so in the kickoff meeting, we developed a list of, I think, 500 different values that watersheds provide that are tied intimately to those watershed functions. And so in the coming year, we'll be developing data layers to start to coalesce around strategic areas for action and different tools that can be used to do that. And it is, again, a partnership-driven approach. PRI is playing a major role in this initiative, as well as Illinois Indiana Sea Grant and Illinois Extension. We had, I think, 50 different scientists from 13 different institutions on campus that came to our kickoff meeting to sort of work together and guide this process as we go forward. We're in the early going. One of the challenges that we face is we're all facing in this room is that without a state budget, we're kind of stuck in the planning phase, but we're hoping that someday a budget will come online and we'll be able to really move forward with this work. But I think the important thing to underscore here is the way we're framing this and thinking about values. So it's not only the functions of the watersheds, but combining those geospatial data with biological information to create tools that evaluate the potential of every acre of a watershed to promote those ecosystem services. Again, thinking about the mandate from the White House, getting at those ecosystem services. What sort of things are these watersheds providing? Is it fishing opportunities, recreation, bird watching, clean water? These are the sorts of considerations and how we can promote functional watersheds to improve those parameters. By doing that, we explicitly tie those values to functions, and you can see a number of them here, to really get at a strong partnership-driven approach that includes the landowners who also care about these things on board, because the challenge that we face is you really can't be dictating them on board as partners if we're really going to make positive strides in that direction. So I'll just summarize here. I think I'm on time so far, about some of the lessons that have been learned in the last couple of years since I've been working on landscape conservation design. And the big one, I think, has been changing that model. As I mentioned previously, historically, these landscape conservation designs were very much species explicit. That really was the impetus behind standing up landscape conservation design, trying to promote habitat for threatened and endangered wildlife and fish. The underlying assumption there is the old field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. If you build these sorts of habitats for piping plovers, you'll get people coming out to use it for recreational activities. We haven't really historically known that that's the case. I think there's great people like Lama who are working on that, and so it's taking that next step to tying it to explicitly understanding within these geographies what's really important, what resonates with those communities, and so what values can they get out of these habitats, and by getting value out of that, becoming an active participant in this broader coalition of conservation-minded people and organizations. We also recognize that success really requires strategic partnerships. Finding those folks and those organizations that really care about these challenges, whether it be coastal wetlands, whether it be water quality, whether it be fish and wildlife, whatever it may be, finding what resonates with different organizations, seeing where those commonalities of priorities lie, and emphasizing those to build on and to drive success at every phase. Integration ultimately yields the important thing. It brings dollars, right? And so by leveraging these opportunities, we can increase the amount of implementation funding. As I mentioned with the coastal wetlands piece, we're already seeing the benefits of our approach here to get that implementation funding into the hands of our partners to continue doing their work, but more importantly, continue doing their work more strategically. So instead, again, of random acts of conservation, it's a part of a holistic, integrated approach that is evaluating every acre of the landscape as opposed to simply what's here right now that I can realistically purchase. The other challenge, I guess, or lesson learned from this is the only certainty is uncertainty. As scientists, we're certainly familiar and comfortable with the idea of uncertainty, but when you're dealing with these partnership-driven initiatives, it becomes a little bit more challenging. You don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. We're in an election year, and that certainly can change sort of the focus of the White House in some of these initiatives, depending on who's in office at this time next year. We could certainly use the state of Illinois as an example. With the funding impasse, makes it very challenging for partners to identify where they're going to be able to leverage funding to do the work on the ground. And so both scientific uncertainty and geopolitical economic uncertainty is a major challenge when you're thinking about these large-scale interjurisdictional approaches to landscape conservation. One of the early lessons we learned is that it's really important when you're rolling this out to your partners to have a well-articulated value-added statement. It sounds callous, but the idea of what's in it for me. And in general, we find that if we can identify where those commonalities and interests are, we can get at this value-added statement. If you care about lake sturgeon, for example, well, why would you care about coastal wetlands? Well, they use those as brooding habitats. And so, okay, great. Well, then I'm on board for caring about coastal wetlands. And so it's finding those areas that resonate with potential partners to expand that scope if we were able to work with. I mentioned this with reference to the Great Lakes especially. Again, there is, well, it's the same in Green Bay as well. There's this deep, rich tradition of collaborative approaches to some of these large-scale problems. Now, it's not to do, there still is that collaborative, working together environment in those geographies and in the Great Lakes as a whole that makes it really easy to get people on board for these sort of larger approaches to these major challenges that we face. And so recognizing the work that's been done, not being redundant with it, but incorporating it into these initiatives and building upon it has been an effective model that we've seen specifically with the coastal wetlands work. And I think it provides the opportunity for innovation at a large scale. And I think that was underscored well in the work that's being done in the Fox River and Lower Green Bay geography. Between their phosphorus markets, these test farms that they set up to try creative and innovative solutions to phosphorus loss into the watershed. By having this sort of spatial science-driven notion of where work should be done on the landscape, you can then begin to deploy conservation targets that you set out. And so I really do feel that that's one of the most encouraging aspects of landscape conservation design, is that it really provides an opportunity for innovation and deployment at a large scale. With that, I think I have plenty of time for discussion, so I'll turn it back over.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. So we have time for questions. Do we have any from the audience here who will take some of those first?
Thank you very much for this talk. just a question on mechanics and logistics
Absolutely.
and communications, and how do you go about keeping communications among group of collaborators, from disparate institutions, or sort of wrangling the different people and
Herding cats.
partners. And so yeah, I'd like to hear some how you've gone about doing it, and some of those lessons learned as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that is one of the more challenging aspects. When you're dealing with these large groups, communication is key. And from a mechanistic standpoint, in both Green Bay and the coastal wetlands work, we have established working groups of about 15 to 30 individuals that hold conference calls on either a monthly or bi-monthly basis. So for the coastal wetlands, we're talking twice a month, and in Green Bay, we're talking once a month. Really, that's where the work gets done. Those are the folks that are strongly invested, that their organizations have given in-kind contribution in their personnel's time to be a part of it. And so that's how we communicate and get the work done. But that's, as you indicate, only part of the story. And that's been a big challenge, particularly with the landscape conservation cooperatives. Tom Melius, who's with Region 3 Fish and Wildlife Service, calls the LCCs the greatest story never told, because they really have been an effective means of bringing together disparate groups of people to the same table to address these large-scale challenges. But no one outside of maybe here and some other pockets throughout the country know about them and know the work that they're doing. And so to get at that, with the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes LCC, we developed a communication strategy specifically for this coastal wetlands landscape conservation design. We just started working on that in the last 6 months, and so with the first products rolling out in late July, early August, and the LCD ramping up, the communication strategy is going to be put into place to deliver this message to the partners. And it actually started last week. We held our first 2 partner meetings, as I mentioned, in Saginaw Bay and in Lake St. Clair, with 40 different participants in each one from that geography with local champions. And it's going to be the first of many conversations. So first is going to be the broader sort of marketing approach. The second is going to be meeting with those folks. It's going to be the first conversation we're going to have more. And we're kind of taking a different approach in Green Bay. They have their community of practice already in place. And so one of the things we've been working on is developing a website that when you go to sites that, for example, the Cat Island chain that I showed, other LCD initiatives that are going on in the landscape, the signs that are up are going to have a QR code that you can scan with your cell phone, and it'll take you right to the adaptive website on your mobile device to talk about the work that's being done and the partners that are involved. And so we're hoping to kind of deploy an innovative approach to communicate that using the folks that are visiting these areas. But you underscore a very important point. It is a big challenge how we communicate this work, because we do have to be strategic and delicate about it. And I will say, in the interest of full disclosure, that's part of the reason why we had to rethink how we are approaching landscape design with the Resilient Watersheds initiative. I won't place a value judgment on it, but in certain circles, when you use the word conservation, it has a negative connotation, and it will immediately move people out of the discussion. And so by focusing more on the values of the watersheds, the shared values, and communicating that aspect up front, we feel it's going to be more effective as a means of getting a broad coalition on board from ag, from industry, from academia, from productive watersheds. And so it's one of the things that keeps me up at night. I will say that is how we communicate this. But I could talk for hours on it, obviously. But yes.
Question. So how did you go about identifying key stakeholder groups within this really large geography?
Yeah, that's another challenge, is identifying who those people need to be. And I think the nice thing is that there are, again, harping on this notion that there's a great tradition to build upon here. There's a lot of great existing relationships. You think about Illinois, you've got Audubon Society, the Nature Conservancy, IDNR, the Prairie Research Institute, Chicago Wilderness, and there's an established network there. And so for the coastal wetlands work, we started with that broader community, the steering committee of the LCC. And what we did was when we decided on our starting geography, that's Saginaw Bay to Western Lake Erie, we talked to the steering committee areas. You know these communities. And those are the people that made it to last week's meeting. We invited those people to sessions, and then we did the same thing with them. So we got those 80 people in these 2 rooms, and we asked them, who is not at this table that we need? And so we'll be inviting those people to a webinar that we'll host in, I think, hopefully early July, to go through it as well, to say, here's what we're trying, here are the products we're thinking about. What do you need to do your job better? What would help you in being more strategic in how you approach your conservation actions? How can we help you leverage funding to implement conservation actions on the ground that use prioritization tool, the potential wetlands tool, the prioritization portfolio that we developed for wetlands? And so that's kind of been the phased approach we use. You start at that executive level, and then you kind of trickle down from there by their input, targeting those folks that they have established relationships with and building from there. Yeah, thank you.
Do you have other questions?
I have a big picture and probably very ignorant questions. It's not my area. But I understand your talk. It sounds like you're doing a very good job of finding partners in these different regions that have firsthand knowledge of the landscape, the ecological challenges in those regions, and have a conservation bent. And you're also figuring out what best bang for the buck. Restoration efforts would have the highest watershed value, et cetera, et cetera. But how do you address or talk about the same social and economic practices and pressures that cause the degradation are still there, right? So whether it's industry in Toledo, in Wisconsin, or the corn farmers here in Illinois, you said you're trying to establish the value of different areas, right? And so if you, I thought I was. Okay, sorry. So for example, right? If you're in Green Bay, if you determine that, say, really, boy, the Green Bay, really the biggest problem is runoff from the dairy farms, and you'll point that out to your partners. Your farmers, thank you very much, and see you later. So
buy your cheesehead hat on the way out.
Exactly. Yeah. So just a few words about that very broad topic.
Yeah, so this is one of the biggest challenges, absolutely. We certainly have it in Green Bay. We certainly have it here in Illinois. Having the wetlands work, the landscape has been being converted rapidly. Is again starting those conversations, but framing it a little bit differently. This isn't, we're the government, we're going to tell you how to run your land. This is looking at what's going on. And so for Illinois as an example, a lot of buy-in on some projects that will fall under the auspices of the Resilient Watersheds Initiative by talking to them about the mandates to reduce nitrogen loss by 45%. That's in place. That's happening. And they're really worried about what sort of regulatory impacts that's going to have on them and what limits. And so they're more interested in being partners on this and trying to find these creative solutions to minimizing their impacts because, pardon me, still behind this cold. I've been talking to a number of farmers recently for some of the work that I've been doing, and I keep hearing the same thing. Well, we care about water too. I drink this water. I fish in these waters. We care about it too. It's not that we don't care. And so it's bringing them on as a partner and saying, okay, well, we have some commonalities in what we think is important, and you're going to have some regulatory impacts coming down the road. So can we be proactive and try and think about some creative solutions, whether it be innovative technology, whether it be trying to determine better management practice, and trying to frame the conversation in that way. And it's not easy, and it's not always effective. particularly because you run into some trust issues. So who you have approaching these conversations is also important. Having a federal agency come in a lot of these instances. And so having a trusted organization begin to broach those conversations is important. And I think that's one of the benefits of being a part of the Prairie Research Institute. And I think in a lot of circles we're a very trusted organization. We've been providing service certainly in the state of Illinois and beyond for a number of years. And it gives us a foot in the door that, for example, EPA might not have. It's a hard thing to do. It's a hard conversation to have. But I think that they recognize that a lot of these partners in industry, in ag, that if they don't make an effort, if they don't start thinking about this now, then they're going to be forced into something that may be even worse than if they're able to find some of these creative solutions in different contexts. But it's hard.
Do we have any questions online? Any other questions here in the audience?
Have you run into much difficulty in how different agencies interpret federal law, state law, what they perceive to be their mandate versus what maybe the law says is their mandate, things like that? Like one of the biggest impediments to restoring wetlands and river systems is the way a certain federal agency interprets the wetland laws.
Yep. Absolutely. The big example I can think of is we had to spend a lot of time on phone calls and webinars with a couple agencies in the Great Lakes on what the definition of is, right? So what does restored mean? What does enhanced mean? What does protected mean? And what the hell's a wetland anyways? That really was like a challenge as to what a coastal wetland is, because you have one organization or one agency that defines coastal wetlands as, I got to remember the definition, within a certain distance from the 100-year high water mark, right? So this is their definition of coastal wetland. We're sitting at a table with a bunch of wetland ecologists that know coastal wetlands are any wetland that is impacted by the hydrology of the Great Lakes. And so you think about Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge, which is, I think, close to 25 miles away from the water levels rise and fall with Lake Huron. It's not within that boundary that's set by the regulatory agency, but it's clearly a coastal wetland, and so absolutely. And so it's similar to having conversations with industry and ag. Is you have to get your foot in the door with a trusted entity and begin saying, all right, we understand your mandates, your regulations, but here's the data we have. And I don't think I underscored this enough in this talk, is that this is all heavily data-driven. I mean, this is built upon a bedrock of science. And so, look, here's the water levels of Shiawassee's wetlands. Here's the water levels of Lake Huron. Look, they're perfectly in sync. They're outside the buffer. How do we bridge this? And so we've actually been able to get some regulatory movement with those agencies on rethinking not only how they define those coastal wetlands, but also restored, enhanced, and protected. And that's why we did the potentially restorable wetland piece, because we started talking to them about, if we want to restore, enhance, and protect 60,000 acres of wetland, there's simply not enough existing wetland to do that. That's just not realistic. And some of those that are already existing, you're going to get a really low return. There's just so much work that has to be done that we need to consider converting areas that have been turned into ag, that have been diked for managed wetlands, as part of that conversation. And so we had to make a compelling data-driven case with these agencies that, yeah, we can turn that farm field into a wetland, potentially cheaper than one up the road that is completely inundated with Phragmites. It's got toxic sediments, and it's just a bad place to be. And so we face those challenges. We'll continue to face those challenges. And I think the difference there is that agencies occasionally are a little bit more receptive to compelling data. And that's what we've tried to bring with us when we have those conversations. Good question.
Are there any other questions here? So with that, Do you have a question? Okay. With that, we want to thank Mark again for coming today and for his presentation. Thanks.
Thank you.